The scream tore through the night air, before the crowd even understood what they were watching. Alira stood at the center of the pack circle, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with disbelief, as the man she had waited her whole life for looked straight through her like she was nothing. "I, Damien, reject you, Alira, as my mate," he said, his voice carrying across the stone courtyard, where every member of the Ashwood pack had gathered. "You are weak. You are nothing. I choose Serafina." The words landed like blows. Alira felt her knees buckle, but she forced herself to stay standing, because falling down in front of these people would be the final humiliation, and she refused to give them that satisfaction. A rejection was supposed to be private, a quiet conversation between two people who realized their bond was not meant to be. But Damien had chosen to do this in front of the entire pack, on the night of the harvest gathering, with torches lit and every eye watching, because he wanted everyone to see her fall. Serafina stood beside him, her golden hair catching the firelight, her lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. She reached for Damien's hand and laced her fingers through his, and the pack erupted into murmurs and whispers that stung worse than shouting would have. Alira's mother, Marisol, stood at the edge of the crowd. For one brief moment, Alira looked toward her, hoping for even a flicker of comfort, a single glance that said she was not alone. Instead, Marisol turned her face away. "You have shamed this family long enough," her father, Corwin, said, stepping forward, his voice low and cold, an Omega who cannot even hold on to her own mate. "Pack your things and leave before sunrise. You are no daughter of mine." The crowd did not gasp. They did not protest. Some of them nodded, as if this outcome had been expected, as if Alira's failure was simply the natural order of things. She had always been different from the other wolves in Ashwood. Her shift was slower, her strength weaker, her senses duller than any Omega should have. The pack had called her cursed for years, though no one could explain exactly why. Now it seemed the rejection was proof enough for everyone. Alira did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would never give this pack her tears, not after everything they had already taken from her. She turned without a word and walked through the parting crowd, feeling every stare like a blade against her skin. Someone laughed. Someone else whispered the word cursed, loud enough for her to hear. She kept walking until the torches faded behind her, and the cold night swallowed her whole. She did not know where she was going. Her feet simply carried her away from the only home she had ever known, past the wooden fence that marked the edge of pack territory, into the wild forest beyond. The trees here were older, taller, their branches knitting together to block out the moonlight. She had been warned since childhood never to wander this far, that the forest led to Blackthorn Cliff, a place the pack elders called forbidden, a boundary line between Ashwood territory and the unknown lands beyond. She did not care about the warnings anymore. What was there left to fear, when everything she had already feared had come true? The wind picked up as she reached the tree line where the forest opened into a wide, rocky clearing. Blackthorn Cliff stretched out before her, a jagged edge of stone that dropped hundreds of feet down into darkness. Far below, she could hear the faint rush of a river cutting through the valley. The moon hung low and silver above her, casting pale light across the rocks. Alira sat down at the edge, letting her legs dangle over the side, staring out at the endless black shape of the mountains in the distance. For the first time since the rejection, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just tonight, but years of it. The whispers, the exclusion, the way the other pups used to run from her when they were children, as if her wolf might infect them with whatever made her so wrong. The way her own parents had never once defended her. She had held on to one hope, foolish as it was. She had believed that when her mate finally arrived, everything would change, that someone, somewhere, was meant to look at her and see something worth loving. That belief had kept her standing through every cruel word and every lonely night. And tonight, the one person the universe had chosen for her had looked into her eyes and called her nothing, in front of everyone she had ever known. A twig snapped behind her. Alira turned to see 3 figures emerging from the tree line. Serafina walked at the front, her golden hair now pulled back, her expression sharp and unreadable. Behind her walked 2 of her closest friends, Ophelia and Marguerite, their eyes gleaming with the kind of excitement that came from watching someone else's suffering. "I thought I might find you out here," Serafina said, stepping closer, the moonlight making her look almost beautiful. if not for the coldness behind her eyes. Feeling sorry for yourself? Alira rose to her feet slowly, putting a careful distance between herself and the edge of the cliff. What do you want, Serafina? I want you to understand something, Serafina said, circling her the way a predator circles something wounded. Damien was always going to choose me. The bond meant nothing. Fate made a mistake pairing him with someone like you, and I simply corrected it. You didn't correct anything, Alira said, her voice steadier than she expected. You manipulated him. You've been chasing him since we were children. Serafina's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that flicker, Alira saw the truth confirmed. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by something colder. It doesn't matter now, Serafina said. You're leaving. You're nothing. And soon, no one in Ashwood will even remember your name. Then let me leave in peace, Alira said, turning to walk back toward the trees. But Ophelia stepped into her path, blocking the way, while Marguerite moved to the other side, boxing her in. Alira's heart began to pound. The cliff edge was only a few steps behind her now. You should have stayed away tonight, Serafina said, stepping closer, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. This would have been so much easier if you had just disappeared quietly. What are you talking about? Alira asked, backing up instinctively, though she knew there was nowhere left to go. An Omega who lost her mate, cast out by her own family, wandering alone into forbidden territory, Serafina said, her eyes glinting with something dark and certain. It will be a very sad story. Everyone will say the heartbreak was too much for her to bear. Alira's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. You wouldn't. I already have, Serafina whispered. She lunged forward. Alira felt hands slam into her chest, hard and sudden, and the ground disappeared beneath her feet. For one impossible second, she was suspended in the cold night air, the stars spinning above her, the cliff face rushing past in a blur of stone and shadow. She tried to scream, but the wind stole the sound from her throat. Below her, the darkness of the valley rose up to meet her, endless and silent, and Alira closed her eyes, waiting for the end. The fall felt like it lasted forever, and no time at all. Her mind raced through fragments of memory, her mother's face before she looked away, the warmth of a home that had never truly been warm, the ache of a rejection spoken in front of the only world she had ever known. She thought, strangely, that she felt no anger in this final moment. Only a quiet, exhausted sorrow, and beneath it, something that almost resembled relief. Then, impossibly, powerful arms closed around her. The impact of being caught nearly knocked the breath from her lungs, but there was no pain, no crushing weight of stone or water. Instead, there was warmth, solid and steady, and a low growl vibrating through a broad chest pressed against her side. She felt herself cradled against something impossibly strong, felt the wind rushing past, as her fall was arrested mid-air by a force she could not understand. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment. Above her, she saw the outline of a face she did not recognize, sharp features cut from moonlight and shadow, eyes the color of molten gold staring down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch even in her half-conscious state. He said something to her, low and urgent, but the words dissolved before she could grasp them. Darkness swallowed her whole. High above on the cliff's edge, Serafina peered down into the void where Alira had vanished, watching the darkness swallow every trace of her. Ophelia and Marguerite stood frozen behind her, their earlier excitement replaced with something closer to fear. Is she gone? Ophelia whispered. Serafina stared into the black abyss for a long moment before turning away, brushing invisible dust from her hands, as if she had simply completed a chore. She's gone. And tomorrow, we tell everyone the story of a heartbroken Omega who could not bear her rejection. No one will question it. No one will even look for a body in that valley. What if someone finds out the truth? Marguerite asked, her voice trembling slightly. Serafina turned back toward the tree line, her expression hardening into something almost regal. No one will find out anything, because there is no one left who would tell them. She did not know, as she walked back toward Ashwood territory with her friends trailing silently behind her, that far below in the valley she believed to be empty, a king had been waiting. Deep in the shadowed valley beneath Blackthorn Cliff, in the ancient and secretive kingdom that bordered Ashwood's forbidden lands, Kale, Alpha King of Shadowfang, had been standing at the edge of his territory, for reasons he could not entirely explain even to himself. He had felt restless that night, a strange pull tugging at the edges of his senses, drawing him toward the base of the cliffs that separated his lands from the world above. He told himself it was simple vigilance, a king's duty to know every corner of his territory, especially the border shared with the unpredictable Ashwood pack. But the truth was something he did not yet understand himself, a whisper in his blood that had grown louder with every step he took toward the cliffs that night. When the scent hit him, faint at first, and then overwhelming, something ancient inside him roared to life. It was not simply the scent of an omega, though that alone would have been unusual this deep into Shadowfang lands. It was something else entirely, something that struck a chord so deep within his wolf that he moved before conscious thought could catch up to instinct. He caught the falling figure without hesitation, his massive form leaping upward from the shadows with a speed that defied the laws that governed ordinary wolves. And when her weight settled against him, when her scent filled his senses completely, he understood with absolute certainty that his entire world had just shifted beneath his feet. He looked down at the unconscious woman in his arms, her dark hair spilling across his forearm, her face pale and peaceful despite whatever horror had led her to fall from that cliff. He did not know her name. He did not know why she had been pushed, or who had done it, or what cruelty had unfolded above him in the dark, but he knew, with a certainty that shook the foundations of everything he understood about his own life, that this stranger in his arms was not a stranger at all. She was his. Kale carried her through the shadowed valley, moving swiftly and silently toward the fortress that served as his kingdom's stronghold, his mind racing through questions that had no answers yet. Who was she? Why had she been thrown from the cliff separating their two territories? And why, after decades of feeling nothing when it came to the idea of a fated mate, had one look at this broken, unconscious woman set his entire body on fire, with a need to protect her that he had never felt for anyone or anything in his life? Behind him, the cliffs of Blackthorn stood silent under the moonlight, keeping their secrets, while above, in Ashwood territory, a lie was already beginning to spread that would soon reach every corner of the pack. A lie that claimed Elira, the rejected Omega, had thrown herself from the cliff in despair, ending her own story in tragedy and shame. But her story had not ended, it had only just begun, in the arms of a king no one in Ashwood even knew existed. Elira did not wake gently. Her eyes snapped open with a gasp, her body jerking upright, as if some part of her was still falling, still bracing for an impact that never came. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared around a room she did not recognize, the walls carved from dark stone, the windows draped in heavy velvet curtains that let only thin strips of moonlight through. For a moment, she believed she had died after all, and that this strange, quiet room was some version of the afterlife she had never been taught about. But the ache in her shoulder, where she must have struck something on the way down, and the dryness in her throat, felt far too real for death. A soft knock came at the door before it opened, and a young woman stepped inside carrying a tray of water and cloths. She had warm brown skin, kind eyes, and dark curls pulled back into a simple braid. She stopped short when she saw Elira sitting upright, her eyes widening with surprise. "You're awake," the woman said, setting the tray down quickly and hurrying to Elira's side. "I did not expect you to wake so soon. How do you feel?" "Where am I?" Elira asked, her voice hoarse. "Who are you?" "My name is Ren," the woman said gently. "You are in Shadowfang territory, in the king's fortress. You were brought here 2 nights ago." Elira's mind struggled to catch up. Shadowfang. She knew the name only as a whisper among the Ashwood elders, a kingdom spoken of with a mixture of fear and respect, ruled by an alpha said to be more powerful than any king in the region. She had never imagined she would find herself inside its walls. "How did I get here?" Elira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, remembering flashes of golden eyes and powerful arms catching her from the air. "The king found you," Ren said carefully, watching Elira's reaction. "He caught you when you fell from Blackthorn Cliff. If he had not been there, you would not have survived." Elira's breath caught in her chest. It had not been a dream then. Someone had truly caught her mid-air, had pulled her back from the darkness she had fully expected to swallow her whole. "Why would a king bother saving someone like me?" Ren's expression shifted, something careful and curious crossing her face, though she did not answer directly. That is a question you will have to ask him yourself. He has asked to be informed the moment you woke. Before Alira could protest, Ren had already moved to the door, speaking quietly to someone stationed outside. Alira pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she must look, dressed in simple garments that were not her own, in a stranger's fortress, surrounded by a kingdom she knew nothing about. The door opened again, and this time the air in the room seemed to shift entirely. He stepped inside with the quiet authority of someone used to commanding attention without ever needing to raise his voice. He was tall, broader than any wolf Alira had ever seen, his dark hair falling loosely around a face carved with sharp, striking features. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath completely, the same molten gold she remembered from the fall, eyes that seemed to look directly into whatever remained of her shattered spirit. "You are awake," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying none of the mockery or cruelty she had grown used to from the men in her life. "Good. I was beginning to worry." Alira did not know how to respond. She had spent her entire life being looked at with disdain, with pity, with the quiet disappointment of people who wished she did not exist. She did not know what to do with the way this stranger studied her now, his gaze intense but careful, as though she were something precious rather than something broken. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, though she suspected she already knew. "Kael," he said simply. "Alpha King of Shadowfang. And you are on my territory, in my home, because I caught you before the ground could." "Why?" The question left her before she could stop it. "Why would you save someone you don't even know?" Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite name. He stepped closer, though he kept a respectful distance, his eyes never leaving hers. "I am still asking myself that question," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But I intend to find the answer." Alira studied him carefully, searching for the cruelty she had learned to expect from powerful men, the same cold indifference Damien had shown her in front of the entire pack. She found none of it in Kael's expression. Instead, there was something almost gentle beneath the strength, something patient. "I fell from Blackthorn Cliff," she said slowly, testing the words. "That's Ashwood territory. Why were you there?" "I was patrolling my border," Kael said. "I felt something before I saw you, a pull I have never experienced before, and then I saw you falling, and I moved before I understood why." Alira's chest tightened at his words, though she did not yet understand the full weight of what he was describing. She had heard stories, whispered among the older wolves in Ashwood, about mates and bonds, and the pull that supposedly connected two souls meant to be together. She had believed in that pull once, foolishly, with Damien, only to watch it shatter in front of an entire pack. "I don't understand what you're saying," she said carefully. Kael was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something kept her rooted in place. "Neither do I, fully. Not yet. But I intend to." Before Alira could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them, and a broad-shouldered man stepped into the doorway, his expression tense. "My king, forgive the intrusion, but there is news from the Ashwood border." Kael's expression shifted instantly, the softness replaced by a sharp, commanding focus. "What news?" "A messenger arrived at the border wall," the man said, glancing briefly at Alira, before returning his attention to Kael. "Word is spreading through Ashwood that an Omega threw herself from Blackthorn Cliff 2 nights ago. They are calling it a tragedy. Her name was given as Alira." The room fell silent. Alira felt the blood drain from her face as the words settled over her like a physical weight. They were already telling the story, already rewriting what had happened to her, painting Seraphina's cruelty as her own despair, erasing the truth before anyone could even question it. "That is not what happened," Alira said, her voice shaking with something between fear and fury. "I did not jump. I was pushed." Kael turned back to her sharply, his entire body going still, the air around him crackling with a tension that made even his own guard take a small step back. "Pushed," he repeated, the word coming out low and dangerous. "By whom?" Alira hesitated, old habits of silence and self-protection rising up inside her, years of being told that her voice did not matter, that no one would believe her over someone like Seraphina. But something about the way Kael was looking at her, The barely restrained fury simmering beneath his controlled exterior made her believe, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone might actually listen. "Serafina," she said quietly, "my mate's chosen replacement." She followed me to the cliff after the rejection ceremony. She and her friends cornered me at the edge, and she pushed me over. Cale's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing beneath his skin, his golden eyes darkening with something that looked dangerously close to rage, though he kept his voice carefully controlled when he spoke again. "And your pack believes you simply jumped. They will believe whatever story makes them look the least guilty," Elira said bitterly. "They have never once chosen the truth over their own comfort." Cale was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her, with an intensity that felt like it might burn straight through her. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost none of its controlled fury, but something else had entered it as well, something steady and certain. "You are safe here," he said. "No one in Shadowfang will hand you back to a pack that tried to end your life, and then lied about it. I give you my word." Elira did not know what to say. She had spent her entire life being told, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that she was not worth protecting. And now this stranger, this king of a kingdom she had never even known existed until 2 days ago, was making her a promise that no one in Ashwood had ever bothered to make. "Why would you do this for someone you just met?" she asked again, quieter this time. Cale's expression softened, though the fire behind his eyes remained. "Because something inside me recognized you, the moment I caught you falling," he said. "And I do not yet understand what that means, but I intend to protect you until I do." Outside, the wind rattled softly against the heavy curtains, and somewhere far above them, beyond the cliffs and the borders and the lies already spreading like wildfire through Ashwood territory, Serafina slept soundly in Damien's arms, believing her crime had been buried forever beneath the rocks of Blackthorn Cliff. She had no idea that the king of Shadowfang was already awake, already furious, and already determined to uncover every piece of the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. 3 weeks passed inside the walls of Shadowfang, and with each day, Elira felt something inside her begin to shift, slowly and cautiously, like a plant, unfurling after a long winter it never expected to survive. She was given her own quarters, a room far grander than anything she had known in Ashwood, with a balcony that overlooked the deep green valley below. Ren visited her daily, bringing food, fresh clothing, and something Elira had rarely experienced in her life: genuine kindness, offered without any hidden agenda. But even as her body healed, her mind remained restless, circling the same unanswered questions night after night. Why had Cale saved her? Why did his wolf react so strongly to her presence? And why, despite everything she had lost, did some small, stubborn part of her feel safer within these unfamiliar walls than she had ever felt inside her own childhood home? She found Cale one evening on the training grounds behind the fortress, alone, moving through a series of combat drills beneath the fading light of sunset. She had not meant to watch him, but something about the raw power in his movements held her in place, the way his muscles coiled and released with practiced precision, the low growl that occasionally escaped him as he pushed himself harder. He noticed her before she could retreat, his gaze snapping toward her even though she had made almost no sound. "You should be resting," he said, though there was no real reprimand in his tone. "I've been resting for 3 weeks, Elira said, stepping out from the shadows of the training yard. "I think my body has forgotten how to do anything else." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and something in her chest fluttered unexpectedly at the sight of it. "Then perhaps it's time we discussed what comes next." He gestured for her to sit on a low stone bench at the edge of the training yard, and he lowered himself beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but far enough to give her space. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable, in a way Elira had not expected. "I have been asking questions," Cale finally said, his voice careful. "About your bloodline. About your family in Ashwood." Elira tensed slightly. "What kind of questions?" "Your mother," Cale said. "Marisol. Do you know much about her history, before she joined Ashwood Pack?" Elira frowned, trying to recall fragments of conversations she had overheard as a child, stories her mother rarely spoke of and always seemed reluctant to finish. "Not really. She came from somewhere in the Eastern Territories before she married my father. She never talked about her life before Ashwood." Kale's expression grew thoughtful, almost troubled. There is an old bloodline, one that was thought to have disappeared generations ago, tied to a line of wolves who once ruled over the eastern kingdoms before a great conflict scattered them and buried their history. Their blood carried unusual strength, unusual gifts, even in wolves who appeared outwardly weak or unremarkable. Illyra's breath caught. You think I'm connected to this bloodline? I think it would explain many things, Kale said carefully, including why your wolf has always seemed weaker than expected within your pack, and why the moment I caught you, my own wolf reacted as though it had found something it had been searching for its entire life. Illyra sat with this information, turning it over slowly, uncertain what to make of it. Her entire life, she had been told her weakness was a curse, a flaw, something shameful to be hidden or apologized for. The idea that it might instead be tied to something ancient and powerful felt almost too large to comprehend. Even if that's true, she said quietly, it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't undo the rejection, or the cliff, or any of it. No, Kale agreed, his voice softening. It does not. But it might explain why you survived a fall that should have killed you instantly, and why something in me refused to let it happen. He turned to face her fully then, his golden eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Illyra, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer frightens you. She swallowed hard, nodding slowly. All right? Do you feel it too? He asked, his voice low. The pull between us. I have never experienced anything like this in my life, not with any of the Luna candidates my council has presented over the years, not with anyone. But since the moment I caught you falling, I have felt something I cannot explain, something that grows stronger every time you are near me. Illyra's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She thought of the warmth that had spread through her chest the moment she woke in his arms, the strange comfort of his presence, even in the middle of her deepest despair, the way her wolf, weak as it had always been called, seemed to stir and hum with recognition every time Kale was near. I feel something, she admitted quietly. I don't know what to call it. I'm afraid to call it anything, because the last time I trusted a feeling like this, it destroyed me. Kale's expression shifted, something fierce and protective flashing across his features. I am not Damien, he said firmly. I will never stand in front of anyone and call you nothing. I will never humiliate you, and I will never let anyone else do so while you remain under my protection. You barely know me, Illyra whispered. I know enough, Kale said. I know that you survived a fall that should have ended your life. I know that you have carried cruelty from the people who were supposed to love you, without ever once letting it break your spirit completely. And I know that every instinct inside me tells me that you belong here, beside me, not because fate has decided it, but because I have chosen it for myself. The words settled over Illyra like warmth spreading through frozen limbs, slow and almost painful in how unfamiliar it felt. She had spent her entire life waiting for someone to choose her, truly choose her, not out of obligation or fate or pity, but because they simply wanted her. And here, in the fading light of a training yard in a kingdom she had never known existed until weeks ago, a king was offering her exactly that. I'm not ready to trust so easily again, she admitted honestly, not after everything. I don't expect you to be, Kale said gently. I am not asking you to trust me completely tonight. I am only asking you to let me prove myself, slowly, for as long as it takes. Illyra looked at him for a long moment, studying the sincerity in his golden eyes, searching for even a trace of the cruelty she had learned to expect from powerful men. She found none, only patience, and a quiet, steady determination that felt entirely different from anything she had known before. All right, she said softly. Prove it. A genuine smile broke across Kale's face then, transforming his sharp, serious features into something almost boyish in its warmth, and Illyra felt her own lips curve upward in response, a small, cautious smile, the first real one she had allowed herself since the night of the rejection. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the fortress wall, one of Kale's own advisors, an older wolf named Ulrich, who had served the Shadowfang throne for decades and did not trust outsiders, especially not ones who arrived under such mysterious and suspicious circumstances. He watched the exchange between his king and the strange Omega with narrowed eyes, already calculating how this unexpected bond might threaten the careful political balance he had spent years maintaining. He turned and disappeared back into the fortress, already composing the message he intended to send to his contacts in the Northern Territories, contacts who would be very interested to learn that the Alpha King of Shadowfang appeared to have found an unexpected and unbonded mate. Far above in Ashwood territory, the story of Alira's death had settled into pack legend, spoken of in hushed, mournful tones by those who felt a flicker of guilt they did not fully understand, and repeated with satisfaction by those who had never wanted her among them in the first place. Damien rarely thought of her at all these days, consumed instead by wedding preparations for his upcoming union with Seraphina, a ceremony that was set to take place within the month. Neither of them knew that the Omega they believed dead was very much alive, growing stronger every day within the walls of a kingdom powerful enough to shake the foundations of everything they had built on top of their lies. Ulrich moved through the fortress corridors with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent decades learning how to disappear into shadows when necessary. He had served 3 generations of Shadowfang kings, and in all that time, he had never once seen Kael behave the way he had been behaving since the night he pulled a stranger from the sky. It troubled him deeply. The Shadowfang throne had survived centuries of conflict and political maneuvering, precisely because its kings had always placed the kingdom's stability above personal desire. A hasty, unverified bond with an outsider of unknown origin, no matter how compelling the pull between them might feel, represented exactly the kind of unpredictable variable that could unravel decades of careful alliance building. He found Kael in the war room, hunched over old maps and ancient texts, clearly continuing his research into the bloodline he believed Alira might belong to. Ulrich cleared his throat softly, waiting to be acknowledged before stepping fully into the room. "My king," he said, bowing his head slightly. "May I speak freely?" Kael did not look up from the text in front of him. "You always do, Ulrich. I doubt tonight would be different." "This Omega," Ulrich began carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had survived many delicate conversations. "You know very little about her true origins. You are basing an enormous decision on instinct alone, on a pull you cannot fully explain, and on the word of a woman who arrived here with no verification of her claims." Kael finally looked up, his golden eyes sharp. "Are you suggesting she is lying?" "I am suggesting caution," Ulrich said carefully. "The Eastern bloodline you speak of has been extinct for generations. If word spreads that you believe it has resurfaced, and that resurfaced line happens to be your fated mate, every ambitious pack and kingdom within 100 miles will suddenly develop a very personal interest in Shadowfang's affairs." Kael's jaw tightened, but he did not dismiss the concern outright, which told Ulrich that some part of his king's mind had already considered this danger. "What would you have me do? Send her back to a pack that tried to kill her?" "Of course not," Ulrich said quickly. "I am simply urging you to proceed carefully. Verify her bloodline through proper channels before making any declarations, and perhaps consider keeping the details of her presence here quiet until we understand the full picture." Kael studied his advisor for a long moment, weighing the wisdom in his words against the growing certainty in his own chest that Alira was exactly who and what his instincts told him she was. "I will proceed carefully," he finally said, "but I will not hide her, and I will not treat her like a secret to be managed. She has spent her entire life being treated as something shameful. I refuse to continue that pattern, even with the best intentions." Ulrich bowed his head, recognizing the finality in his king's tone, though the worry did not leave his expression as he departed the war room. He had survived long enough at court to know that even the wisest kings could be undone by matters of the heart, and he intended to keep a very close watch on how this particular matter unfolded. Elsewhere in the fortress, Alira sat with Ren in a small sunlit study, surrounded by old books and scrolls that Ren had gathered at Kael's request, hoping to find any thread of information about the Eastern bloodline and Alira's mother's origins. Alira ran her fingers over the yellowed pages of an ancient text, feeling a strange mixture of hope and apprehension building inside her. "Do you really think it's true?" Alira asked quietly, glancing up at Ren. "That I could be connected to some ancient line of powerful wolves? It feels impossible. My whole life, everyone has called me the weakest wolf they'd ever seen." Ren smiled gently, setting down the scroll she had been examining. "Sometimes, the things we are told about ourselves say far more about the people speaking than about the truth of who we actually are." Your pack called you weak, because your gifts did not look the way they expected strength to look. That does not mean the strength was never there. Alira considered this, turning the words over carefully, testing whether she could believe them the way she had never quite been able to believe anything kind said about her before. It's strange, she admitted. For so long, I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Now everyone here keeps suggesting there might be something extraordinary instead. I don't know which version to believe. Maybe neither version is entirely accurate, Ren offered gently. Maybe you're simply you, and the people around you have always been the ones deciding what that means, rather than letting you discover it for yourself. Alira smiled at that, a small, genuine smile that had been growing more frequent in recent days. You're very wise for someone who spends most of her time delivering food trays and old books. Ren laughed softly. I have been at this fortress a long time. I have watched kings come and go, watched alliances form and crumble. You learn a few things about people along the way, whether you intend to or not. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and Kale stepped inside, his expression a careful mixture of determination and something gentler that softened whenever his eyes landed on Alira. Not at all, Alira said, feeling a familiar warmth spread through her chest at his presence, a warmth she was slowly growing less afraid of acknowledging. We were just discussing ancient bloodlines and the questionable wisdom of trusting everything you're told about yourself. A faint smile crossed Kale's face. Sound wisdom. I came to ask if you would walk with me. There's something I'd like to show you, if you're feeling well enough. Alira glanced at Ren, who gave her an encouraging nod, before rising to her feet. I think I'd like that. Kale led her through the fortress and out into the cool evening air, along a winding path that climbed gently up a hillside overlooking the valley. As they walked, Alira found herself increasingly aware of the small distance between them, the way his hand occasionally brushed against hers, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him even in the cooling night air. They reached the top of the hill, where the entire valley spread out below them, moonlight silvering the tops of the trees, the distant fortress walls glowing faintly with torchlight. Alira drew in a breath at the sheer beauty of it, a beauty entirely different from the cold, familiar landscape of Ashwood. This is where I come when I need to think clearly, Kale said quietly, standing beside her. When the weight of ruling becomes too heavy, or when a decision feels too large to carry alone. Why bring me here? Alira asked softly. Kale turned to face her fully, his golden eyes steady and sincere in the moonlight. Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I don't feel the weight of carrying everything alone, and I wanted you to see the place that helped me understand that. Alira's breath caught at the quiet vulnerability in his words, so different from the guarded coldness she had grown used to from every man she had known before him. She looked out over the valley, feeling the pull between them grow stronger, undeniable now in a way she could no longer dismiss as simple gratitude for having her life saved. I'm still afraid, she admitted quietly, of trusting this, of trusting you. I know, Kale said gently, and I will wait as long as you need. But I want you to know that whatever this pull is between us, I do not intend to walk away from it, no matter how long it takes for you to feel safe enough to walk toward it yourself. Standing there beneath the stars, with the valley spread out silver and endless below them, Alira felt something inside her begin to shift once again, the last remnants of the fear that had gripped her since the night of the rejection, slowly loosening their hold, replaced by something she had almost forgotten was possible to feel. Hope. The letter arrived on a quiet morning, carried by one of Kale's scouts who had been monitoring the border near Ashwood territory as part of a routine patrol. Ulrich brought it directly to Kale, his expression tight with the particular kind of urgency that meant trouble. You need to see this, Ulrich said, handing over a folded parchment sealed with the Ashwood crest. Kale broke the seal and read quickly, his expression darkening with each line. The letter was from Corwin, Alira's father, addressed formally to the Shadowfang throne, requesting a meeting to discuss what he called an urgent matter concerning pack property that had recently gone missing from Ashwood territory. Pack property, Kale repeated, his voice low and dangerous. He is referring to his own daughter as property. It gets worse, Ulrich said grimly. Read the second page. Kale flipped to the following sheet and felt his jaw clench as he read. The letter went on to claim that Alira suffered from a condition that caused delusions and fabrications, warning that anything she might have said about being pushed from the cliff was almost certainly a symptom of her unstable mental state, and requesting her immediate return to Ashwood for proper care under her family's supervision. They are trying to discredit her before she can even speak the truth publicly, Cale said, his voice tight with restrained fury. They know she survived. They are working to control the narrative before it can spread. How would they know she survived? Ulrich asked. Unless someone within Shadowfang has been talking. Cale's expression hardened further. Find out who. Meanwhile, in a quiet garden courtyard within the fortress, Alira sat with Ren, unaware of the letter that had just arrived, enjoying one of the first truly peaceful mornings she had experienced in weeks. The garden was full of blooming flowers, unlike anything that grew in the colder climate of Ashwood, their bright colors a striking contrast against the dark stone walls surrounding them. You seem lighter today, Ren observed, watching Alira trail her fingers gently over a cluster of deep purple blossoms. Happier. Alira smiled softly, though a hint of uncertainty still lingered in her expression. I think I am, slowly. It still feels strange, though, like I'm waiting for something to shatter it all over again. That's understandable, Ren said gently. Healing rarely happens all at once. It happens in small moments, like this one, stacked carefully on top of each other, until eventually you look back and realize the weight has become lighter than it used to be. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps, and Cale appeared at the garden entrance, his expression carefully controlled but tight with tension that Alira could read immediately, having grown familiar with the subtle shifts in his usually composed demeanor. What's wrong? She asked, rising to her feet. Cale hesitated only a moment before deciding, as he had promised himself he would, that honesty was owed to her above all else. A letter arrived from your father. He is requesting your return to Ashwood, claiming that your account of what happened at the cliff is the result of some kind of mental instability. Alira felt the familiar sting of betrayal rise in her chest, though it landed with less force than it once might have, softened by the weeks of genuine care she had received within these unfamiliar walls. Of course he is, she said bitterly. It's easier to call me delusional than to admit what actually happened. You do not have to return, Cale said firmly. I will not force you to go anywhere you do not wish to be, and I certainly will not hand you over to people who have already tried to destroy you once. I know, Alira said quietly, though something new was beginning to stir within her, something that felt less like fear and more like resolve. But maybe I should go back. Cale's expression shifted with surprise and immediate concern. Alira. Not to stay, she clarified quickly, but to face them, to speak the truth in front of the pack myself, rather than letting them continue to bury it beneath their lies. I spent my entire life being silenced by that pack. I don't want to spend the rest of it running from them instead. Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her from any possible danger and his growing respect for the strength she was showing, a strength that had nothing to do with the physical power her pack had always dismissed her for lacking. If you choose to go, he finally said, you will not go alone. I will accompany you, and I will bring enough of my own guard to ensure your safety. No one will lay a hand on you again, while I am able to prevent it. Alira felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes, an unfamiliar sensation after years of expecting to face every hardship entirely alone. Thank you, she whispered. You do not need to thank me, Cale said softly, stepping closer, his golden eyes warm despite the tension of the situation. Protecting you is not an obligation I carry reluctantly. It is something I choose, every single day, and will continue choosing for as long as you allow me to. Ulrich, who had followed Cale into the garden and stood quietly observing the exchange, cleared his throat gently. My king, if I may, there is wisdom in caution here. Returning to Ashwood, even under heavy guard, carries significant risk, both to Alira's safety and to the political stability of Shadowfang. I understand the risks, Ulrich, Cale said, not unkindly, though his tone left no room for argument. But I will not ask her to hide from the truth, simply to protect my own comfort or convenience. If she wishes to reclaim her voice in front of the people who tried to silence it permanently, then I intend to stand beside her while she does. Ulrich bowed his head, recognizing the finality in his king's decision, though the concern in his expression did not fully fade. He had served long enough to understand that some battles were not worth fighting, especially when a king's heart had already made its choice. Later that evening, as preparations began quietly for the eventual journey back toward Ashwood territory, Elira stood on her balcony overlooking the valley, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. She thought of the pack she had left behind, the family that had disowned her, the mate who had humiliated her in front of everyone she had ever known, and the woman who had tried to end her life entirely. For the first time since the night of the rejection, she did not feel afraid of facing them. She felt ready. Behind her, she heard Cale's familiar footsteps approaching, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression of quiet admiration that still felt entirely new and unfamiliar, though increasingly welcome. "Are you certain about this?" he asked gently. "I am," Elira said, and for the first time, she truly believed it. "I spent my whole life letting other people decide what my story would be. It's time I decided for myself." Cale crossed the room and stood beside her at the balcony railing, close enough that his warmth wrapped around her like a second layer of protection against the cooling evening air. "Then, we face it together," he said, "whatever comes." Elira nodded, turning her gaze back toward the horizon, toward the mountains that separated Shadowfang from Ashwood, toward the cliff where her old life had ended and this unexpected new one had begun. Somewhere beyond those mountains, a wedding was being planned, a lie was being maintained, and a pack believed the truth had been buried forever. They had no idea how wrong they were about to be proven. News of Elira's survival reached Ashwood territory faster than anyone in Shadowfang had anticipated, carried by a careless word from a border guard who had seen the preparations underway for the journey and mentioned it to a trader who frequently crossed between territories. By the time Cale's scouts realized the leak had occurred, the information was already spreading through Ashwood like wildfire. Damien received the news while standing in the middle of wedding preparations, surrounded by decorations meant for a ceremony that was now only 2 weeks away. His father, Alaric, delivered the message personally, his weathered face tight with barely restrained alarm. "She's alive," Alaric said without preamble. "Elira, she survived the fall, and she's been recovering in Shadowfang territory this entire time. Word is, the Alpha King himself pulled her from the cliff." Damien felt something cold settle in his stomach, though he could not immediately identify whether it was guilt, fear, or simply the inconvenience of a carefully buried problem suddenly resurfacing at the worst possible moment. Everyone said what Serafina told them to say," Alaric snapped, his patience clearly worn thin. "And now the Alpha King of Shadowfang, one of the most powerful rulers in the entire region, may know exactly what really happened out there. Do you understand what this means for this pack if he chooses to act on it?" Damien's jaw tightened. He had spent the weeks since the rejection ceremony carefully avoiding any thought of Elira, throwing himself instead into the excitement of his upcoming union with Serafina, allowing himself to believe the comfortable lie that her death, tragic as it seemed, had at least resolved the inconvenience of an unwanted mate cleanly and permanently. "What do you want me to do?" Damien asked. "Find Serafina," Alaric said grimly, "and find out exactly what happened that night. Because if the Shadowfang King arrives at our borders demanding answers, I want this pack prepared with a story that will hold up under scrutiny, not one built on lies that could unravel the moment she stands in front of us and tells the truth herself." Damien found Serafina in her private chambers, already aware of the spreading rumors, her expression carefully composed despite the panic simmering visible just beneath the surface. When he told her what his father had said, her composure cracked slightly, though she quickly forced it back into place. "She's lying," Serafina said immediately. "Whatever she's telling that king, she's lying, trying to turn everyone against me before our wedding." "Serafina," Damien said slowly, studying her face with a scrutiny he had not applied in weeks. "Tell me the truth. What happened at that cliff?" "I already told you what happened," Serafina said, her voice sharpening with the kind of defensive edge Damien was beginning to recognize as a warning sign. She was distraught after the rejection ceremony. She wandered to the cliff on her own and jumped. I found her there, tried to stop her, but I was too late. "Then why," Damien asked carefully, "would Elira claim otherwise, in front of the king of a kingdom powerful enough to crush this entire pack if he chose to?" Serafina's eyes flashed with something dangerous, something Damien had never allowed himself to fully examine before now. too blinded by golden hair and easy affection to notice the coldness that occasionally surfaced beneath her beauty. Because she has always hated me. Because she wants to destroy what we're building together, even from beyond the grave, apparently. Something about her explanation felt hollow, rehearsed, and Damien found himself, for the first time since the rejection ceremony, genuinely doubting the version of events he had accepted so easily weeks ago. He thought of the way Alira had looked at him that night, not with hatred, but with a quiet, devastated heartbreak that had never once shifted into anything resembling malice, even as he humiliated her in front of the entire pack. "If you're lying to me," Damien said slowly, his voice low, "the consequences will fall on all of us, not just you." Serafina's expression softened instantly, her hand reaching for his, her voice dropping into something practiced and soothing. "Damien, you know me. You know I would never hurt anyone. Alira is simply bitter, and now she has found powerful allies to help her spread her bitterness. We need to stand united, present a strong front, and this will pass." Damien did not fully believe her anymore, though he was not yet ready to fully confront what that meant, both for his upcoming wedding and for the choices he had already made. He nodded slowly, pulling his hand away under the guise of needing to attend to preparations, though the doubt continued to grow steadily in the back of his mind. Meanwhile, at the Shadowfang border, Kale's traveling party made final preparations for the journey toward Ashwood territory. Alira stood beside a sturdy horse, dressed in traveling clothes that Ren had carefully selected, her posture straight and determined despite the nervous energy she could feel humming beneath her calm exterior. "You do not have to do this," Kale said quietly, approaching her side as the rest of the guard finished their preparations. "We can send a formal delegation instead. Demand answers without you needing to face them directly." "I know," Alira said, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I need to do this myself. I need them to look at me, alive and standing, and know that their lies could not erase me the way they hoped." Kale studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud flickering behind his golden eyes. "Then let us make certain they understand exactly what they are facing." The traveling party set out at dawn, moving steadily toward the border that separated Shadowfang from Ashwood territory. The same border Alira had crossed weeks earlier as a broken, falling stranger, and now crossed again as someone entirely different, someone who had discovered, slowly and carefully, that she was capable of far more strength than anyone had ever allowed her to believe. As they approached the familiar boundary line, Alira felt her chest tighten with anticipation, old fears mixing uncomfortably with newfound resolve. Beside her, Kale rode with quiet, steady confidence, his presence a constant reminder that whatever awaited them on the other side of that border, she would not be facing it alone this time. Word of their approach reached Ashwood territory hours before their actual arrival, sent ahead by Kale's scouts as a formal notice of the Shadowfang King's intent to enter Packlands. Alaric received the message with a growing sense of dread, immediately summoning Corwin, Marisol, and the Pack's senior council members to prepare for what was clearly going to be a confrontation none of them were fully ready to face. "He's bringing her back," Alaric said grimly, looking around at the gathered council. "The Shadowfang King himself is escorting her to our borders. Whatever she intends to say, she intends to say it in front of the entire pack." Corwin's face had gone pale, old guilt he had buried beneath years of dismissal and denial rising unexpectedly to the surface. Marisol said nothing at all, though her hands trembled slightly where they rested in her lap, memories of turning away from her own daughter's desperate gaze, suddenly refusing to stay buried any longer. Outside, the pack gathered in nervous, murmuring clusters, word spreading rapidly that the Omega they believed dead was not only alive, but returning, under the protection of one of the most powerful kings in the region. Whatever comfortable story they had told themselves about that tragic night at Blackthorn Cliff was about to be tested against a truth none of them were prepared to hear. The Shadowfang party arrived at the edge of Ashwood territory just as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the same courtyard where Alira had once stood and listened to Damien reject her in front of everyone she had ever known. This time, she rode at the front of the procession, seated beside Kale, her spine straight, her expression calm despite the storm of emotion churning beneath her composed exterior. The pack had gathered in a wide, uneasy crowd near the courtyard entrance, whispers rippling through them the moment Alira's face became visible beneath the fading light. Gasps followed quickly, along with murmurs of disbelief, some pack members crossing themselves instinctively, as though still uncertain whether they were looking at a living woman or some kind of vengeful spirit. Alaric stepped forward to greet them, flanked by Corwin and several senior council members, his expression carefully neutral, despite the tension radiating from his rigid posture. "Alpha King Kale," he said formally, bowing his head. "Welcome to Ashwood territory. We were not expecting such an esteemed escort." "I imagine not," Kale said, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, cool and commanding, in a way that made several pack members instinctively lower their eyes. "Considering your pack, believe the woman beside me had already died." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the crowd. Corwin's face had gone rigid, his eyes fixed on Alira with an expression that flickered briefly between guilt and something harder to name, before settling into careful neutrality. "Alira," Corwin said stiffly, "you are alive." "Yes," Alira said, her voice steady, despite the way her heart pounded against her ribs. No thanks to the story this pack chose to believe. Whispers spread rapidly through the gathered crowd, and Alira caught sight of Damien standing near the front, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. Beside him, Seraphina's face had drained of color, though she quickly forced her composure back into place, her chin lifting defiantly. "I am glad you survived," Seraphina said, her voice carrying carefully rehearsed sympathy. "We all mourned you deeply, Alira. Your episode at the cliff frightened everyone." "Episode," Alira repeated, her voice sharpening. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Kale dismounted first, moving to Alira's side and offering his hand to help her down, a small gesture that nonetheless sent a fresh wave of whispers through the crowd, many of them beginning to piece together the implications of a Shadowfang king treating a rejected Ashwood Omega with such open protectiveness. "Perhaps," Kale said, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard, "you would like to explain to your pack exactly what kind of episode causes bruised hand marks across an Omega's chest, consistent with being forcefully pushed, rather than jumping willingly from a cliff's edge." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Seraphina's face went white, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of Kale's steady, unwavering gaze. "That's absurd," Seraphina said quickly, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I have no idea what he's referring to." "I do," Alira said, stepping forward, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, despite the tremor she could feel building beneath her ribs. "I was standing at the edge of Blackthorn Cliff after Damien's rejection ceremony, trying to process everything that had happened. Seraphina followed me there, along with Ophelia and Marguerite. She told me my death would make a very sad, convenient story, and then she pushed me." The courtyard fell into stunned silence, broken only by scattered gasps and the low murmur of pack members, turning to whisper urgently to one another. Ophelia, standing near the edge of the crowd, had gone pale, her eyes darting nervously toward Seraphina, clearly wrestling with whether to speak. "She's lying," Seraphina said, though her voice had begun to shake slightly. "Why would anyone believe an Omega who has spent her entire life resentful of the attention I received, over someone who has served this pack loyally for years?" "Because," Kale said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous that made even Alaric take an involuntary step back. "I found her mid-fall, Seraphina. I felt the panic in her scent, the terror of someone who had been thrown, not someone who had chosen to jump. Wolves do not lie about the scent of fear in another wolf's blood, no matter how carefully they might construct a story afterward." Seraphina's composure shattered entirely, panic flashing openly across her face as the crowd's murmurs grew louder, more accusatory. Pack members, who had once accepted her story without question, now exchanging uncertain, suspicious glances. "Ophelia," Alira said quietly, turning to face her former tormentor directly. "You were there. You know what really happened. Please, just tell the truth." Ophelia's hands trembled visibly, her eyes darting between Seraphina's furious glare and Alira's steady, pleading gaze. For a long, tense moment, the courtyard held its breath, waiting. "She's telling the truth," Ophelia finally said, her voice cracking with the weight of guilt she had clearly been carrying for weeks. Seraphina pushed her. "Marguerite and I were there. We didn't stop her, and I am so sorry, Alira. I should have stopped her." Serafina rounded on Ophelia with a look of pure venom, but it was too late. The truth had already broken free, spreading rapidly through the stunned crowd, and there was no story elaborate enough to contain it any longer. "You will explain yourself," Alaric said sharply, turning to Serafina, his voice carrying the weight of a pack leader, who understood exactly how much damage this scandal could inflict on Ashwood's standing among the surrounding territories, especially with the King of Shadowfang standing as a witness to the unraveling truth. Damien stared at Serafina with an expression of dawning horror, the comfortable lies he had allowed himself to believe, collapsing rapidly beneath the weight of Ophelia's confession. "You tried to kill her," he said slowly, disbelief coloring his voice. "You let me believe she took her own life, and it was you all along." "I did it for us," Serafina said desperately, reaching for Damien's hand, though he pulled away instinctively. "For our future together." She was never going to accept the rejection quietly. She would have found some way to make our lives miserable. "She never got the chance to make any choice at all," Cale said coldly, "because you decided to end her life before she could. That is not protecting a future. That is murder, disguised as convenience." The courtyard had fallen completely silent now, every eye fixed on Serafina, whose desperate justifications had done nothing but confirm every accusation leveled against her. Illyra stood tall amid the wreckage of the lie that had almost buried her memory entirely, feeling something powerful settle into place within her chest. A sense of vindication she had not realized she needed quite this badly until this very moment. Cale stepped forward, his presence commanding absolute silence from the gathered crowd. "As King of Shadowfang, and given that this crime occurred at the border shared by our territories, I formally demand that justice be carried out according to the laws governing both our kingdoms. Illyra and Ophelia's confession stand as testimony. I expect Ashwood's council to act accordingly, and act swiftly." Alaric, recognizing the political and physical danger of denying a king's demand, particularly one witnessed by his entire gathered pack, nodded stiffly. "It will be done. Serafina will face judgment before this council immediately." As guards moved forward to detain Serafina, her desperate protests filling the courtyard air, Illyra felt Cale's hand find hers, warm and steady, grounding her against the chaos unfolding around them. She looked up at him, and in his golden eyes, she saw not pity, but pride, fierce and unwavering. "You did it," he said quietly. "Just for her. You reclaimed your voice." Illyra looked around at the pack that had once cast her aside so easily, watching them scramble now to reckon with the truth they had been so eager to bury, and felt something inside her finally settle into place after weeks of uncertainty. She was no longer the girl who had been pushed off that cliff. She had become someone else entirely. In the days that followed the confrontation at Ashwood, the Pack Council convened repeatedly to determine how to handle the growing scandal that threatened to unravel their standing among neighboring territories. Serafina remained confined under guard within a secure chamber, her desperate pleas for leniency falling on increasingly unsympathetic ears, as more details of her cruelty toward Illyra came to light with each passing day. It was Marguerite who ultimately broke first, her guilt proving too heavy to carry, once Ophelia's confession had already cracked the foundation of their shared silence. She came forward voluntarily, describing in detail the weeks of planning that had gone into staging Illyra's death, revealing that Serafina had been plotting the confrontation at Blackthorn Cliff since well before the rejection ceremony ever took place, waiting only for the right opportunity to make her actions appear as a tragic, heartbroken accident. The revelation sent fresh waves of shock through the pack, many members now openly questioning how they could have so easily believed the convenient story they had been handed, without ever pausing to question its inconsistencies. Corwin, watching the scandal unfold with a growing weight of guilt pressing against his chest, found himself unable to meet his daughter's eyes whenever their paths crossed within the pack grounds. Illyra remained at Ashwood during this period, staying in guest quarters provided by the council rather than returning to her childhood home, a decision that spoke volumes about the fractures that remained between her and the family who had disowned her so readily weeks earlier. Cale remained close by as well, though he divided his time carefully between overseeing the unfolding justice process and managing correspondence from his own kingdom, where Ulrich had been left temporarily in charge of daily affairs. One evening, as the Pack Council prepared for what would be Serafina's final judgment hearing, Marisol found Alira alone in the guest quarters, standing at the window and watching the sunset paint the sky above the same mountains that had once witnessed her near death. "May I speak with you?" Marisol asked quietly from the doorway, her voice carrying none of the coldness Alira remembered from the night of the rejection ceremony. Alira turned slowly, studying her mother's face, searching for any trace of the woman who had turned away, rather than offer comfort during her darkest moment. She found instead someone who looked smaller than she remembered, weighed down by guilt that had clearly been building for weeks. "You can come in," Alira said, her voice careful, guarded but not entirely closed off. Marisol stepped inside, wringing her hands nervously. "I have wanted to speak with you since the moment you arrived, but I did not know what words could possibly be enough to address what I did, what I failed to do." "You turned away from me," Alira said quietly, the old hurt still sharp beneath the surface, even after everything that had happened since. "In front of everyone, I looked at you, hoping for even the smallest sign that you cared, and you turned away." Tears welled in Marisol's eyes, though she did not try to excuse her actions or deflect the accusation. "I know. I have relived that moment every single day since, wondering how I could have been so weak, so afraid of the pack's judgment, that I abandoned my own daughter when she needed me most." "Why were you so afraid?" Alira asked, genuinely wanting to understand, even as old anger simmered beneath her question. Marisol was quiet for a long moment, gathering the courage to speak a truth she had buried for years. "Because I know what it feels like to be an outsider in this pack. I came from a bloodline that Ashwood viewed with suspicion long before you were born. I spent years trying to prove I belonged here, trying to erase every trace of where I came from, and when you were born with a wolf that seemed weaker than expected, I panicked. I was terrified that your differences would expose mine, that the pack would begin questioning both of us." Alira absorbed this revelation slowly, pieces of a puzzle she had never fully understood beginning to click into place. "The bloodline," she said quietly, "the one Cale has been researching." Marisol's eyes widened with surprise. "You know about it?" "Cale believes I might be connected to an ancient bloodline from the Eastern Territories," Alira said, "one that was thought to have disappeared generations ago." Marisol's breath caught, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all, clearly wrestling with a truth she had kept hidden for decades. "My grandmother," she finally said, "was the last known survivor of that bloodline, before she fled the conflict that scattered her people. She never spoke of it openly, fearing it would mark our family as targets. I inherited fragments of that history, and I made the choice to bury it completely, rather than risk anyone discovering it." "You knew," Alira said, disbelief coloring her voice. "You knew there might be an explanation for why I was different, and you never told me." "I was afraid," Marisol admitted, her voice breaking, afraid of what it would mean if the truth came out. Afraid of losing the fragile place I had built for myself within this pack. I let that fear control every decision I made, including the decision to abandon my own daughter, rather than risk exposing a secret I had spent decades trying to hide. Alira felt a complicated tangle of emotions rising within her, anger and grief intertwined with a reluctant flicker of understanding. She had spent her entire life believing her mother's coldness stemmed from simple disappointment in her weakness, never imagining it might instead be rooted in fear, passed down through generations of hiding. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Alira said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time." "I don't expect you to," Marisol said quietly. "I only wanted you to know the truth, even this late, even after everything I've already cost you. You deserved better than the mother I allowed fear to turn me into." Alira nodded slowly, unable to offer the reassurance her mother was clearly hoping for, but unwilling to dismiss the vulnerability in her confession entirely either. "Thank you for telling me," she finally said. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it helps me understand it a little better." Marisol left quietly after that, leaving Alira alone with her thoughts, staring out at the mountains as the last light of sunset faded into darkness. She thought about the weight her mother had carried silently for so many years, the fear that had ultimately cost them both so much, and wondered how many other lies within Ashwood had been built upon similarly buried truths. Cale found her there later that evening, still standing at the window, lost in thought. He said nothing at first, simply moving to stand beside her, offering his quiet presence as comfort, without demanding she explain what troubled her. My mother explained everything, Illyra finally said, about the bloodline, about why she was always so afraid of who I might be. Cale listened carefully as she recounted the conversation, his expression thoughtful. It does not excuse how she treated you, he said gently, when she finished. But it does help explain the fear that shaped this entire pack's treatment of you, long before you ever understood why. I keep thinking about how different everything might have been, Illyra admitted, if she had simply told me the truth from the beginning, instead of letting me believe I was simply broken. You are not broken, Cale said firmly, turning to face her fully. You never were. You were simply surrounded by people too afraid to recognize what they were actually looking at. Illyra looked up at him, feeling the familiar warmth that had grown steadily stronger between them over the past weeks, no longer tinged with the uncertainty and fear that had once accompanied it. And what were they looking at? She asked softly. Cale's expression softened, his golden eyes warm in the fading evening light. Someone extraordinary, he said simply. Someone I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain never doubts that truth again. Tomorrow would bring Serafina's final judgment, and with it, the closing of one painful chapter of Illyra's story. But standing here beside Cale, feeling the quiet strength of his presence and the steady certainty of his words, Illyra understood that a new chapter had already begun. One built not on fear or hiding, but on truth, finally allowed to breathe freely into the open air. The judgment hearing took place in the same courtyard where Illyra had once been rejected, where she had once been pushed toward her supposed death, and where the truth had finally broken free days earlier. The entire pack gathered once again, the atmosphere thick with tension, entirely different from the cruel excitement of the rejection ceremony weeks before. Serafina stood before the council, her golden hair no longer perfectly styled, her composure entirely stripped away after days of confinement, and the mounting weight of evidence against her. Ophelia and Marguerite stood nearby as witnesses, their earlier fear replaced by a somber determination to finally set things right, even if it meant condemning someone they had once considered a close friend. Alaric presided over the proceedings, his expression grave as he addressed the gathered crowd. We have heard testimony from Illyra, corroborated by Ophelia and Marguerite, confirming that Serafina deliberately pushed a member of this pack from Blackthorn Cliff with clear intent to end her life, and subsequently fabricated a story to conceal this crime from the entire pack. Serafina's eyes darted desperately around the courtyard, searching for any flicker of sympathy among the gathered faces, finding none. Even Damien, standing near the front of the crowd, refused to meet her gaze, his expression a mixture of betrayal and quiet devastation at having so thoroughly misjudged the person he had chosen as his mate. Serafina, Alaric continued, his voice heavy with the weight of pack law, you stand accused of attempted murder against a fellow pack member, and of fabricating false testimony to conceal your crime. Given the severity of these actions, and the direct involvement of Alpha King Cale in uncovering the truth, this council has no choice but to strip you of your pack status entirely, and banish you from Ashwood territory, effective immediately. Gasps rippled through the crowd at the severity of the sentence, though few voices rose in protest, the horror of Serafina's actions having thoroughly eroded whatever sympathy she might once have commanded within the pack. Serafina's composure finally shattered completely, desperate sobs breaking free as guards moved forward to escort her from the courtyard. Damien, she cried out, reaching toward him one final time. Please, you have to believe I did this for us. Damien's expression remained stony, any lingering affection he might have felt for her having curdled entirely into disgust over the past several days. You did this for yourself, he said quietly. You always did everything for yourself. I was simply too blind to see it until now. As Serafina was led away from the courtyard, her desperate protests fading into the distance, Alaric turned his attention toward the gathered crowd, his expression grave. This council also owes a formal apology to Illyra for the failure of leadership that allowed such cruelty to occur, unchecked within our territory, and for the years of mistreatment she endured before this tragedy ever took place. Illyra listened to the formal apology with a strange, distant sense of vindication, one that felt less satisfying than she might have once imagined, now that the moment had actually arrived. She had spent so many years dreaming of a moment when the pack would finally acknowledge her worth, and now that it had come, she found herself less interested in their belated recognition than in the future waiting for her beyond Ashwood's borders entirely. Corwin stepped forward hesitantly once the formal proceedings concluded, his expression carrying the same weight of guilt Alira had seen in her mother's eyes days earlier. "Alira," he said quietly, "I know an apology cannot undo the harm I caused you. But I am sorry. For every moment I made you feel unworthy of this family's love." Alira studied her father for a long moment, searching for the same reluctant understanding she had extended toward her mother, finding it more difficult to summon in this moment, standing in the courtyard where his rejection had felt sharpest. "I appreciate you saying that," she finally said, "but I don't think I belong to this family anymore, not in the way I once hoped to. I've found something else now, something I'm not willing to give up in exchange for a family that only values me, now that a king has proven my worth for me." Corwin nodded slowly, accepting the boundary she had drawn without protest, recognizing perhaps that he had lost the right to expect anything more from her after everything that had happened. Cale stepped forward then, moving to stand beside Alira, his presence steady and certain, as it had been from the very beginning of their unexpected journey together. "Ashwood Pack," he said, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, commanding the attention of every gathered wolf. "I formally request permission to claim Alira as my mate, and to welcome her into Shadowfang territory, as befits her true standing and bloodline." A fresh wave of murmurs spread through the crowd, many pack members exchanging glances of surprise, mixed with something that looked uncomfortably close to belated regret, as they began to fully understand the magnitude of what they had so carelessly cast aside weeks earlier. Alaric bowed his head respectfully. "Ashwood Pack has no claim over Alira any longer, given the circumstances of her departure. She is free to choose her own path, wherever it may lead her." All eyes turned toward Alira then, waiting for her response, the same crowd that had once watched her humiliation, now watching instead for the moment that would mark her transformation into someone entirely beyond their reach. Alira looked around at the faces that had once dismissed her so easily, then turned to meet Cale's steady golden gaze, feeling nothing but certainty settle firmly into place within her chest. "I accept," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the courtyard, with a strength that would have been unimaginable to the broken girl who had once sat at the edge of Blackthorn Cliff, believing her life was ending. "I choose Shadowfang. I choose this bond, freely and completely." Cale's expression softened with a warmth that transformed his sharp, commanding features entirely, and he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, in front of the entire gathered pack, a gesture that carried none of the cruelty Damien's rejection had once inflicted, offering instead a promise of belonging she had spent her entire life searching for. As the courtyard erupted into a mixture of murmurs and reluctant applause, Alira felt the last remnants of Ashwood's hold over her finally release completely, replaced by the steady certainty of the future waiting for her, and beyond these familiar, painful borders. Tomorrow, she would leave for Shadowfang, not as the broken, rejected Omega who had once fallen from Blackthorn Cliff, but as a woman who had reclaimed her voice, her strength, and her rightful place in a story that was only just beginning to unfold. Weeks passed following Alira's return to Shadowfang, weeks filled with a kind of quiet healing she had never believed possible after everything she had endured. Ren remained a constant, comforting presence, and even Ulrich, still cautious by nature, had begun to soften slightly toward the young woman who had so clearly won his king's heart, watching as she handled the weight of her new position with a grace that quieted his earlier concerns about her unproven origins. Research into her bloodline continued, and with it came confirmation that Alira's connection to the ancient Eastern line was undeniable. Scholars from neighboring kingdoms, intrigued by the rumors spreading of a resurfaced royal bloodline, sent careful inquiries to Shadowfang, eager to learn more about the woman whose survival of an impossible fall had already become the subject of quiet legend throughout the region. But amid all the political intrigue and careful diplomacy, Alira found herself most at peace in the quiet moments spent simply beside Cale, watching sunsets from the hillside where he had first shown her the valley below, sharing meals in comfortable silence, slowly building the kind of trust that had once felt entirely impossible to imagine. On the evening of the ceremony marking their formal union, the entire fortress had been transformed, warm lantern lights spilling across every corridor, the scent of blooming flowers carried in from the garden courtyard where Alira had once spent so many quiet mornings with Ren. Representatives from several neighboring kingdoms had arrived to witness the occasion, drawn by curiosity about the mysterious Omega who had captured the heart of Shadowfang's notoriously guarded king. Alira stood in her chambers, dressed in a gown of deep midnight blue that Ren had helped select, studying her reflection with an expression of quiet disbelief. The woman staring back at her bore little resemblance to the broken figure who had once stood at the edge of Blackthorn Cliff, ready to accept whatever fate the world decided to hand her. "You look every bit the queen you are about to become," Ren said softly, adjusting a final strand of Alira's dark hair. "I still don't quite believe it," Alira admitted, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping her. "A few months ago, I was being told I wasn't even worthy of an Omega's place within my own pack. Now I'm about to become queen of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the entire region." "You were always worthy," Ren said firmly. "The world simply needed time to catch up to what was true all along." The ceremony took place at sunset, on the same hillside where Kale had first shown Alira the valley below, the golden light of the setting sun, casting everything in a warm, glowing hue that felt almost too beautiful to be real. Alira walked toward Kale slowly, her heart pounding, with a mixture of nervousness and overwhelming joy, watching as his expression softened with quiet wonder at the sight of her. When she reached him, he took her hands gently in his golden eyes shining with an emotion so raw and sincere that Alira felt tears gathering unbidden in her own eyes. "From the moment I caught you falling," he said quietly, his voice carrying just for her despite the gathered crowd surrounding them, "I knew my life had changed irrevocably. I did not yet understand why, or what it would mean, but I knew I would spend the rest of my existence grateful that I was standing beneath that cliff at exactly the right moment." "You saved my life," Alira whispered, "in more ways than simply catching me." "You saved mine as well," Kale said softly. "I did not realize how much I had been missing until you arrived and showed me what it truly meant to build something out of choice, rather than obligation." As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and violet, Kale and Alira exchanged the formal vows that would bind them together as king and queen of Shadowfang, their bond sealed not merely by fate's pull, but by the deliberate, steady choice they had each made to trust one another, slowly and completely, despite everything that had once threatened to make trust impossible. The gathered crowd erupted into celebration as the ceremony concluded, and Alira found herself swept into a whirlwind of congratulations, warm embraces from Ren, respectful bows from Shadowfang's council members, and even a hesitant, genuine smile from Ulrich, who offered his sincere well wishes with none of the earlier suspicion that had once colored his interactions with her. Later that evening, as the celebration continued below in the fortress halls, Alira found herself once again standing on the hillside overlooking the valley, Kale's arm wrapped securely around her waist, the two of them watching the stars emerge slowly across the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about that night?" Alira asked quietly. "The cliff. If you hadn't been there, if your instincts hadn't pulled you toward the border at exactly that moment." "I try not to," Kale admitted honestly, "because the thought of a world where I never found you feels like a far greater tragedy than the fall itself. But I am endlessly grateful that whatever force guided me there that night chose to intervene." Alira leaned into him, feeling the steady warmth of his presence, the same warmth that had first pulled her back from the darkness threatening to swallow her whole months earlier. She thought of the broken, rejected Omega, who had once believed her story was ending on that cliff's edge, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed since that terrifying, pivotal night. "I used to think falling from that cliff was the worst thing that ever happened to me," she said softly. "Now I think it might have been the moment everything finally started going right." Kale pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, holding her close beneath the star-filled sky. "Then let us make certain every day that follows honors that truth," he said, "together, for as long as we both shall live." Below them, the valley stretched out silver and peaceful beneath the moonlight, the same valley that had once caught a falling, broken woman, and delivered her instead into the arms of a king who recognized, from the very first moment, exactly what kind of treasure had fallen into his life. Alira, once cast aside and left for dead by the people who were supposed to love her most, had become Queen of Shadowfang, standing now not as someone who had survived a tragedy, but as someone who had transformed that tragedy into the beginning of an entirely new and extraordinary life. And as the stars shone brightly above the kingdom she now called home, she understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that she was exactly where she was always meant to be.